This video is a conversation I recently had with Dr. Avi Loeb. Dr. Loeb is a professor of science at Harvard University. He's the author of a number of books as well as numerous journal articles in his field of science. This conversation is admittedly a weird one because we talk about, well, weird things, namely extraterrestrial existence and UFOs. I mean, everybody's talking about UFOs these days. So when you have a chance to talk to a premier scientist, you always go for the weird things at first, right? You always talk about the aliens. Well, okay, so in this conversation, it was slightly easy to do because in recent years, Dr. Loeb has been in the news because he's searching for evidence for extraterrestrial existence. He started a project called the Galileo Project, which wants to do just that. It wants to clarify the nature or an understanding of UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena, otherwise known as UFO. He wants to search for artifacts that exist from ETI or extraterrestrial intelligence, and so he started this project to do that. It's a fun conversation. I enjoyed it very much. I let him do a lot of talking. There were a few moments where I really wanted to chime back in and offer rebuttals to some things that he said, especially when it comes to some of his remarks on theology. But I decided to let him talk. I was here to hear from him and to listen to him. And so, anyway, I hope you find the conversation as fascinating as I did. It's admittedly, as I said, a weird topic, but then again, science is one of those things where in many respects, it invites us to discovery, and discovery is the very thing that Dr. Avi Loeb wants to pursue, and he wants to spend his time focusing on something that is well, potentially quite extraordinary. Okay, I'm here with Dr. Avi Loeb from Harvard University. He is an astrophysicist, does a lot of work in that area, astronomy and all the fun sciences. And I'm very grateful, Professor Loeb, for your time, and love to ask you some questions about a pretty strange topic.
My pleasure. Actually, there is nothing strange in reality. It's only the limits that we put, or the blinders that we put. Sometimes we lose the magic, so to speak.
Yeah, that's very good. Good point. So I've been thinking about this topic for quite a while. A friend of mine, he's a Catholic theologian, Paul Thigpen, has written a book on ET and religion, the Catholic faith, Christianity, and so it's a topic that's interesting to me for a number of reasons. And a lot of people in our tradition, C.S. Lewis has talked about this topic a lot. And so I have some questions, particularly about your work, the Galileo Project, which I find completely fascinating. I love it.
But can I make sort of a general comment before we get
Yes.
into the specific questions you had in mind?
Sure.
Two things that I wanted to mention, that things that in the past we ascribed in religious texts to God, in principle, could represent accomplishments that science can make. For example, we are on the path of developing life in the laboratory. In other words, synthetic life, just from chemistry. And obviously that was attributed as a divine quality in religious texts, creating life. And humans might at some point be able to do it from a soup of chemicals. And there are some laboratories trying to do that. The second is, we have some data on the universe, how it evolved since the early beginning, since the Big Bang, so to speak, because it's expanding. So we go back in time, and there was a point in time when everything started, which in principle is consistent with what's said in the Old Testament, the first chapter, Genesis, where things started at a point in time. And the question is, what happened before the Big Bang? Okay. And one possibility that I was thinking about recently was that, if we understand how to unify quantum mechanics and gravity, which are two pillars of modern science, then in principle, we can engineer creating a baby universe in the laboratory, potentially. So what I'm trying to say is that a very advanced scientific civilization that can create a baby universe in the lab or life in the lab will share some qualities that we previously assigned to God. Okay, so in a way, for us, this is a path. If we discover such a civilization, which is definitely a possibility, because most stars formed billions of years before the sun, and it's possible there is another civilization out there that is far more advanced technologically and scientifically than we are, and they already know how to make a baby universe in the lab and how to create life in the lab. So for us, it would be sort of an approximation to what we thought about God, this very advanced civilization that, let's say, is 1 billion years ahead of us. That's the first point I wanted to mention. And the other thing I wanted to say is that, we might be very surprised at what we find if we search for it. And very often we don't search for the unknown. We don't search for the unexpected. We only search for the familiar. And that is a limitation. And that includes the scientific community right now that is not willing to engage in such a search. But the Galileo Project that you mentioned is a way for me to break that mold, and we can talk more about it. So I'll let you ask questions.
Yeah, I have so many follow-up things to say about that. It's really interesting. Even if something like panspermia is the case, and I know a lot of people, interestingly enough, are talking about that. It seems to me you would still need an intelligence prior to that, because
right.
where did that civilization comes from?
That's
right?
Exactly right.
So, yeah,
that's exactly right. It doesn't solve the how it started question.
Sure. That's definitely a philosophical
you're
question.
Right.
Yeah. But I like essentially the assumption that you've just made, though, is that the start of creation, if you want to call it creation, the start of it would have to have been an intelligence, right? In some sense.
Definitely. So, the only question is, so in the view that I mentioned before, you can have, just like humans have babies that can make babies generation after generation. Mm-hmm. You can have big bangs inside big bangs. So whenever a civilization is advanced enough, it creates, let's say, a baby universe that inside of it, there are scientists that make a new baby universe and so forth. But the question of where it's all started is still remains. I completely agree. It's like the chicken and the egg. This problem of having a chicken and an egg. The question is how it started. In order to have an egg, you need a chicken. In order to have a chicken, you need an egg. So where... And what biologists say, that it started from something completely different. And what religious people say, that indeed it started from something different.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, I have a million follow-up thoughts on this for sure. I'm a philosopher by background too, so it's a fascinating topic. I want to get, if it's okay, I'd like to get to Galileo Project, ET, and specifically some things that I think your Galileo Project kind of assumes about ET. Yeah. Okay. So according to the overview of the Galileo Project article, you had sent me that earlier. You say something like astroarchaeological artifacts are remnants of. You want to look at astroarchaeological artifacts or remnants of ET civilizations, or potentially active equipment near the Earth. And you mentioned that same paper that obviously you're agnostic with respect to the results, as any good scientist would be. And but typically, even before that, a researcher has to find the project worthwhile and perhaps even demonstrate that there's some evidence to warrant such an investigation. So why do you think searching for an ET civilization, specifically ones that are close nearby, why do you think that's worthwhile? Is there evidence to suggest that something like that is worthwhile?
Well, two reasons. First, the broader reason is that exploring the unknown is very worthwhile, in my opinion, because it expands our imagination. Our imagination is very limited. And by the way, this is a common thread between spirituality and the frontiers of science. In both cases, you explore the unknown. And I think an agnostic approach where you don't assume that you know the answer in advance is a good one, because then you might be surprised. Okay. But in the case of ET or extraterrestrial intelligence, there are some good reasons to do the search, and that is we exist, okay? Yes. And we live on a planet that we call Earth. It's just a rock that was left over from the construction project of the sun, okay? We know that. We see other stars forming, and we see planets like the Earth near them. In fact, 3% to 100% of all the stars like the sun have a planet the size of the Earth, roughly at the same separation. So we know that nothing is unusual about the solar system. And if you just roll the dice, even if you are completely, take a completely secular approach and say, it's just a random process of chemistry that leads to biology, that leads to intelligence on those rocks. Everywhere there are tens of billions of them in the Milky Way galaxy alone, and then 1 trillion galaxies like the Milky Way. Then if you roll the dice tens of trillions of times, surely we are not alone, right? I mean, that makes little sense that we are so special. And then that means that we should search, because most of the stars formed billions of years before the sun, so they had a jump start. I mean, they preceded us by at least 1 billion years or a few billion years, and that's enough time for them to send the probes that will arrive to us by now. I mean, even using chemical rockets, the type that we used so far for space exploration. So what I'm saying is it makes a lot of sense to say we exist, conditions are similar elsewhere in billions of other planets. Therefore, something like us could have existed 1 billion years ago. Therefore, they would have reached us by now. Therefore, we should just look. I mean, that's like common sense. And anyone that has a problem with that, I think, shows arrogance, in the sense that, oh, I'm special. There is nothing like me anywhere. And moreover, I'm the smartest. So people that argue we are the smartest species that ever existed, I don't think that's likely. I think there was someone smarter than Albert Einstein on another planet 1 billion years ago. That's very likely. And therefore, we should have a sense of humility. So, by the way, there are several things here that connect to spirituality. One is, I believe that the message we get from the universe, based on the data we have, is stay modest. Don't be arrogant. Nothing about you is special, unique, or privileged, which is common also to spirituality. I mean, you have to be modest and humble. Arrogance is the source of all evil. And the second thing the second message that you get is, like, be open-minded, explore the unknown. And I arrived at those principles after 60 years. I'm 60 years old, and it took me a while. When I was young, I didn't necessarily believe in those principles, but I just listened to what nature tells me through scientific exploration. I'm not religious, but I arrived at those principles, and I really respect the fact that people in other areas of life, like religious studies and so forth, have advocated for those principles from a completely different perspective.
Yeah, often theologians will talk about God reveals himself through his book, the Bible, holy text, right? But he also reveals his self through nature, through even the Jewish text, right? The heavens declare the glory of God, so yeah, I can resonate with a lot of that. Seth Shostak wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. I think it came out yesterday.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, essentially saying ET, yep, they're out there more than likely, but like UAP
Objects.
type stuff, they're nowhere near us. It's not physically possible.
Okay, so here is my take on that. That makes very little sense. Completely doesn't make sense, because it's just like saying, okay, let's wait at home for a phone call. This is what Seth Shostak was engaged in. The entire SETI community, since Frank Drake initiated the search for radio signals 70 years ago, okay? They were looking for radio signals. It's just like waiting at home for a phone call, okay? You can wait forever, nobody would call you. Okay, my point is there is a completely different method, which is to go out and check your mailbox.Maybe you have some packages. That is a completely different method. You may have no phone call because, other civilizations died by now, because they predated us by 1 billion years or billions of years. We are not synchronized with them. We don't listen to them when they were sending those messages. We were not around. And so, you just miss these phone calls, okay? But if they send packages, they keep accumulating in your mailbox. These spacecraft that anyone sends, that we send, are moving at a speed that is much slower than the escape speed from the Milky Way galaxy. So they're bound by gravity to the Milky Way, and they keep accumulating. All the spacecraft over the past few billion years are still around. And so my point is, it's a completely different method. And for a scientist to declare that checking the mailbox makes no sense and that we should keep waiting for a phone call, is ridiculous. So I just don't understand. And by the way, I mean, Seth Shostak is not engaged in scientific research. And the same is true with Neil deGrasse Tyson, who keeps making negative statements about it. These are people that are publicizing science and talking about the fact that they are astrophysicists. But in fact, if you check their record, they haven't published a scientific paper in more than a decade. Okay, so these are people that talk about science as if they, from a point of authority, but they haven't really engaged in the trenches of doing research in science. And just to give you a sense, I wrote more than 1,000 scientific papers by now. So I'm steadily involved in scientific research. What I'm telling you is what I think as a result of doing the research. So, you can have commentators dismissing this approach or another, but to me, it makes little sense to basically say, no, we don't want to look at our mailbox because the likelihood of that is extremely small, and it's just about phone calls. Why? Why would that be? And I'm trying to argue that, in fact, there could have been a lot of civilizations that are not around anymore, and you would never listen to any signals from them because those are far away. They moved at the speed of light, those signals, and they're at the edge of the universe now. But if you were to check for packages, you have a chance of finding. And only over the past decade, we had the instrumentation that allows us to do that. And we discovered 4 objects from outside the solar system, 2 of which I found with my student, Amir Siraj, and they are meteors. We're going on an expedition to Papua New Guinea in about half a year to find the fragments from this meteor because it appeared quite unusual. It was tougher than iron, and we want to find out whether it's an artificial object based on its composition, whether it's made of some alloy or maybe it's some unusual meteor that is not similar to the space rocks we had seen so far. It definitely much tougher than all the space rocks we had seen. So my point is, we have to explore that without making general statements ahead of time. It's really completely inappropriate for someone to say this is not worth doing without doing it.
I suppose that you could summarize it in this way. SETI is waiting for someone to knock on their door, but a researcher, you say, is going to go knock on other doors.
Not knock, just look through your windows. How can you find your neighbors if you don't look through the windows or use telescopes for that? So what they're saying is, they're taking the easy path, which is to say, we developed radio communication over the past century. Let's listen to other radio communication from others.
Sure.
And I say the past century is just one part in 100 million of the history of the Earth. Okay, the Earth existed for 4.6 billion years based on all records. So just arguing that there is someone else exactly at the same technological phase that is using the same communication technology as we are over the past century, that's completely inappropriate because they might be much more advanced than we are.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Good point. So you mentioned in your overview of the Galileo Project paper that your research could discover ET civilization controlling UAPs. You also mentioned in another article, I think it's on the Medium website, that quote you hope quote that clouds of uncertainty on the nature of UAP will soon disappear. And that seems to imply that you think the UAP phenomenon is real. What do you think of UAP? Is it a real phenomenon?
Well, it's definitely real. The only question is whether it's human-made or natural. So the data that was released by the government is not conclusive, and they may have much better data, better images, better record that is classified. And you could wait for the government to declassify their data, but that's like waiting for something that may never happen, And my point is the sky is not classified. That's why the Galileo Project built a suite of instruments that will monitor the sky and will make the data open and everyone can look at it. So I'm saying there are objects the government admits they cannot identify. They are mostly interested in national security and defending the nation and maintaining the safety of military personnel. They don't have a scientific agenda of finding what is out beyond Earth, because that's not a national security risk at the moment. So I'm saying they are driven by something completely different. Their agenda is different. They're not scientists. We can do the job and clarify what these objects are.
Yeah, the motives of inquiry are different. What everybody's hoping to get out of it is different. But in a sense, the subject, the substance of, the investigation, it's the same. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. It's the same, but just to give you an example, tourists can use their cell phones to look at things, and the images will always be fuzzy because they're using cell phones to take images. But suppose a scientist comes to the scene and uses a high resolution camera, that is much bigger aperture that can get much better data, then of course one image like that is worth 1,000 words by those tourists, because they don't use good equipment. So my point is, it really depends on the quality of the data that you get. And so different people can talk about the same thing, but some people are doing a very superficial job. So the point is, it's not worth much.
Gotcha. Yeah. But is this one of your motivations for the Galileo Project? Is all the UAP talk, the 2017 New York Times article came out? Is that part of your motivation?
Yeah, okay. It's intriguing. And to me, it's intriguing enough to have a scientific research project on it. Now, I get a lot of pushback from the academic community because it's not within the mainstream, but I think it's a very exciting, I think much of the public cares about it. There were polls that indicate that 2/3 of Americans believe in extraterrestrial life, and slightly less than half believe in God. Okay, so now I don't know how much overlap there is between the two.
It'd be interesting to know.
Yeah, it would be interesting to check. But and as I said, the frontiers of science often overlap with spirituality, because in both cases you're exploring the unknown. So my point is, a very large contingency of society cares about it. Therefore, we must explore it.
So you're talking about mainstream science and the pushback that you get. This topic always reminds me of Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's a book that comes up sometimes. So do you think that we're in the middle of a scientific revolution with respect to ET, UAP, what you're doing? Are we seeing this in a Kuhnian
I think so.
sort of...
I think so. Because if you think about it, well, first, the US government is the only organization monitoring the sky all the time because they worry about national security. So obviously they will be the ones to first notice something unusual. And then astronomers, are also monitoring the sky. And, I wrote in my book, Extraterrestrial, about the first reported object from outside the solar system being very unusual. And then we have the 2 meteors that I discovered with my student being very unusual. So I'm saying there is a hint that we are on the cusp of a revolution in the way we perceive ourselves. Because so far in the scientific community, we always imagined the universe at large being dead, lifeless, made of stars, made of dark matter, made of objects that have no life. If you open any textbook on cosmology, the study of the universe, you will never find the mention of life in the universe in it. But I actually wrote a textbook last year, Life in the Cosmos, which, so I believe we are on the verge, and I'm trying to, if we don't search, we will never find it. And what astronomers are doing is searching for primitive life, microbes. Because once again, if we find microbes, we can remain arrogant, because we would say we are much smarter than they are. So a lot of people feel comfortable about that. But and then they say the chance of finding something more intelligent is really small, but that's just because it flatters our ego. And I say, let's be open-minded. And in fact, we might find intelligent gadgets well before we find microbes, if we only allow ourselves to search for it. And gladly, I received private donations from a lot of individuals. And I should tell you, after my book appeared, about half a year, I got an email from a rabbi in Ann Arbor. His name is Dobrosin, and he wrote a sermon for the Jewish high holidays inspired by my book. And then this year, a year later, I received another email from a different rabbi who wrote a word of Torah inspired by my book, Extraterrestrial. So it clearly implies that there is a lot of interest. among people involved in spirituality in this subject. And I feel honored to explore it despite the pushback that I get. And there are personal attacks, but I don't care. I don't have a footprint on social media. I don't care what other. I think I just follow my common sense.
Yeah, no, it's fair enough. Yeah, I do think that there's a lot of interest with respect to spirituality and what a lot of people. And I'm trying to. Part of what I'd love to see is more theologians weighing in on the topic, and because I think there's a lot to be said there, but there's a lot of academics outside of religious studies who are talking about this. Gary Nolan, yourself, there's a lot of people talking about this. Diana Pastolka, and she's in religious studies, but so
So here is the point. A lot of people talked about it for centuries.
Right.
It's not about talking about it. It's the question of advancing our knowledge by conducting research about it. So you see, that's the key. The key for the previous, let's say, Copernican revolution about whether the Earth is at the center of the world or not, the key was looking through telescopes. That's what Galileo Galilei argued. And without looking through telescopes, people could have believed whatever they want. They could have talked about it for a millennium. They did. I mean, after Aristotle, they always said, oh, we are at the center, because that flattered people's egos. Okay.
Sure.
But my point is, the advance or the revolution in the way we perceive ourselves came out of looking through telescopes. Okay. So, a lot of people can talk about it. Polska can talk about it. Gary Nolan can talk about it. A lot of philosophers can talk about it, but that's not really the way we will make progress. The way we will make progress is looking through telescopes.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So my background is in old religious texts. So whether it's the Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical texts, Greco-Roman stuff. And one thing that I found in say Suetonius's or just any text really, there's a lot of commonality when people talk about strange experiences that they have, and my own interest is in the structure of the experiences and that people have, and the commonality that exists even within different groups who say they experience things. And the reason I'm bringing this up to you is because one thing that I've noticed is that in many reports, whether it's in the Bible or other texts, one thing that is very common is when people say they experience something that they might classify as religious or supernatural, whatever. If it's a group experience, some people in the group will have one experience of that thing, and then but the structure of the experience will look differently for another person in the group. And you see this a lot in UAP reports. I was just hearing I was hearing Gary Nolan at Stanford, right, talk about that very thing with respect to a UAP report in I think it was in France or Italy. Or anyway, so here's my question to you. You're looking for the hard data. You're assuming that it's very possible, likely even that things are flying around the Earth and you can detect them nearby. But are you limiting yourself to just the scientific spectrum? Are there more ways? I mean, because it doesn't seem like these things always want to be picked up.
Okay.
So what would you say that?
Here is my take on that.
Sure.
Throughout human history, there were lots of false reports because humans are not scientific detectors. Humans can be fooled by hallucinations. I mean, humans can take recreational drugs and live in some virtual reality. In fact, nowadays, you don't need to take drugs. You just need to put goggles on your head and go to the metaverse. Yeah. And in the metaverse, you will live in a virtual reality that is completely different than the reality we all share. So the key of advancing our knowledge, when I'm talking about advancing our knowledge, it's about the reality that we all share, not the reality that a single individual experiences. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the difference. That's the difference. And I don't deny that a single individual had experienced something unusual. I just say what I care about personally is the reality that we all share. Like, for example, whether the Earth moves around the sun or the sun moves around the Earth is a reality that we all share. How do we know? Because when we launch a spacecraft, we can look at the Earth from a distance. In fact, we just had a spacecraft that NASA launched, and the Earth appears as a blue marble. Okay. And we can tell if the Earth moves around the sun or the sun moves around the Earth. We can look at it. Okay,
Yeah,
so my point is, that's the reality we all share. If you go on a spacecraft, you go as an astronaut, any person that goes as an astronaut will see the same thing. It would be obvious that the Earth moves around the sun and not the other way around. Obvious, okay, from looking at it. So that's the reality that we all share. However, you can put goggles on your head and live in a reality where the sun moves around the Earth, where gravity operates in a completely different way. Fine, you could be happy and say, I experienced that reality, but that's not what I care about. Avi Loeb cares about as a scientist.
That makes sense.
Okay, so in order to figure out the reality that we all share, and the reason that we need to do that is because if you understand how viruses work, you can develop mRNA vaccines. You can save lives of people. If you understand that the Earth moves around the sun, you can design spacecraft that will reach Mars, okay? If you understand what quantum mechanics is all about, you can build gadgets, computers, cell phones that allow the two of us to communicate. Without the quantum mechanics, we would never be able to speak to each other, okay? So my point is, once you figure out the reality that we all share, you can adapt to it, you can shape it in ways that helps you. Okay, and that is the difference. If you are a single experiencer, okay, you experience something, but it's not the reality that we all share. Therefore, you can't really engineer it to build a gadget that will take advantage of what you experienced. Okay, that's the difference. So in order to figure out the reality that we all share, you need instruments, not people that experience it. And the instruments have are recording data that is quantitative and is repeatable. You can reproduce it again and again. That's the principles by which. So that's what I care about. And that's what the Galileo Project is about. And I don't deny the fact that individuals may have experiences, but it doesn't advance our scientific knowledge.
No, I totally get what you're saying. And that's one of the great things about science is that it's testable, it's repeatable, it's falsifiable, and that you're going after the nuts and bolts so that you can produce a paper and that can be checked later. And that has to be done, of course. I guess I'm just asking because I wonder if is there. I mean, according to someone like Gary Nolan, who told this fantastic, interesting story about several people experiencing one of these things that you seem to be looking for. They're just different experiences. There was even a camera photo of it, and he said he saw the photo.
No. So if he gives me a photo with good enough quality, I can analyze it. But if he just tells me this person experienced that, I cannot use that for scientific research.
But the photo, according to Gary, was not really what they reported seeing. So my point is that there seemed to be some sort of cognitive subjective element to the objective experience.
Sure.
And so I wonder if we're only looking in a small light, small spectrum, are we missing something?
Okay, so here is the way I understand the situation. That what you are talking about experience is the interaction of a human being with the reality that we all share. Okay, so there is this element of the human being interacting. Now, sometimes the reports by individuals reflect the reality that we all share. Definitely. There are people that report about something, and indeed there is something. Okay, even if they are the only ones that reported about it because they happen to be at the right place at the right time. Definitely, or they have some sensitivity that others do not. Okay, but in order to make a claim about new scientific knowledge, you need to validate it. Okay, so I'm not dismissing the fact that this human experienced something. I'm just saying, okay, if this is the interaction between you as a human and reality, and I want to learn about the reality. I don't care about you as a human. That's not the part that I want to learn about. I mean, if I wanted to learn about you as a human, I would just study you. Okay, but that's psychology, that's theology, that's other, but as a scientist, what I care about is the reality. And that's the second part of the equation. Okay, you have the person experiencing reality. So if I want to figure out whether what you are telling me about reality is real, then I have to look at the reality with instruments. And that's okay.
Fair.
So
that's good.
I'm saying this can help guide me. People tell me that they experience something unusual. That's definitely useful because it guides me what to look for.
Yeah, no, I love it. I'm a fan of science. I love it. So I love the Galileo Project's focus. Just a last question. We only have a couple minutes, I guess. So it's called the Galileo Project, and you're talking to a biblical studies guy, a theologian. I would be. It just seems appropriate to ask.
Yeah.
What would you say? What would you say to people working in religious studies, theology, biblical studies, whatever? With respect to this topic, what would you say to the academics in that realm? I'm just thinking Galileo. The church messed up.
Yeah.
Right.
So so the reason that this is called the Galileo Project is because he argued that one should look through the telescope to find what happens in the sky. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's a very simple idea. Okay. It just says, look up instead of assuming that you know the answer. That's all. And that's the principle that I advocate. And that's why it's called the Galileo Project. Now, at the same time, so that shows the limitations of some people that refuse to look through telescopes and know the answer in advance. We talked about some of them. Seth Shostak says, I know the answer. There is nothing to look for. Or show me the evidence before I'm even looking for it. And I say, how can you get evidence if you're not looking? That is inconsistent. It's a circular argument to say we don't have extraordinary evidence, therefore we should not look. That makes no sense. So you have that part. But then the other thing, is that the mainstream of the scientific community is very conservative. It's using past knowledge to argue that there is nothing new, that there is nothing magical, nothing beyond what we already know. That is very common among experts. And so aside from the people refusing to look through telescope, there is this other community of the mainstream in academia that are not allowing magic to happen, are not allowing for something unknown to surprise us, and are not even, so they're not funding searches for that and not studying that. And I say that's a mistake as big as the other one of those people. I mean, it's actually a very similar quality, because when you're saying there is nothing to look for, like Seth is saying, then you will never find anything. If you're not willing to allow yourself to find wonderful things, you will never find anything new. And so what I'm saying is, let's allow ourselves to find some magic in our life, in the world. And let's, of course, we can be intrigued by people reporting experiences, but let's use scientific instruments to validate them. And it might well be that the reality, what we call reality, we are missing something really fundamental in it that could be extremely rewarding once we find it. So I'm saying, let's, even as scientists, from a completely secular perspective, let's explore the unknown. Okay, that's what I'm saying. There could be some magic in it. And for people that are engaged in theology, they already believe that there is something unusual and magical beyond the physical reality that we have in front of our eyes. And so I say, well, we have a common cause here. Okay. And as I said, there is a path even to unify the two if we find something that goes well beyond what we ever imagined. Okay, so I think the future could be very exciting, and it's only a matter of the next few years, the next decade. If we allow ourselves to find something wonderful, we might find it.
Yeah, that's very good. Hey, I want to say thanks for your time. I really appreciate your willingness to chat with me. It's been informative. I love talking to really smart people, and you're a really smart person. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. But even though you gave me a compliment, I would say, what I represent is probably minuscule compared to what might be out there.